Hello and welcome to my guide on how to edit landscape photos in Lightroom. Now, as a disclaimer, I actually still use Lightroom 5 instead of the new 6 because I did not get the chance to upgrade yet. However, that won't change anything I'm gonna be doing today. The only option I would have in Lightroom 6 would be the haze tool, but I wouldn't use that on this image anyways because there is no haze. So again, I have Lightroom 5. I know it says in the title Lightroom 6 how to edit landscapes, but whether you have Lightroom 5 or Lightroom 6, it will make no difference whatsoever in this particular case. So I've got here this beautiful sunset I've shot a couple of months ago. I've never got the chance to edit it, so I thought I'd record the whole process on how I edit this image from scratch to the finished image while commenting on it, on what I do, why I do it. So the first thing I always do in landscape pictures is bring down the highlights. I never bring them up. Usually I bring them down quite a lot. Sometimes even -100. In this particular case, I think somewhere around 70 works pretty well. And the next step I always do is bring up the shadows, usually +100. You see here, that's the before and that's the after. That's already a big change, but of course we're not done yet. Now in this situation it would have been great to have a split ND filter because the sky is very bright. But unfortunately I didn't have one on me at this time I shot the picture, and I'm just not a big fan of HDR. So anyways, let's continue here. What I'm gonna do, and what I'm doing on all of my landscape pictures, is bring down the blacks. Via holding the Alt key I can see wherever the black points are clipped. I'm gonna let go of it and just play around until I see a setting that I like. I think that's pretty well. That looks pretty well here. And the next step is to bring up the whites. Again, I'm gonna hold down the Alt key and move the slider up. And whenever there's color or something else than black in the picture while holding down the Alt key, it means that the part of the image is overexposed, and I don't want that. So I'm gonna put up the slider as much as I can while not clipping any of the whites. So that looks pretty well. And I'm gonna play around with the contrast. I think a little bit of contrast will work pretty well here. Around 30. Yeah, that looks pretty good. And the exposure, I don't think I'm gonna change anything to the global exposure. I'm gonna add a split ND filter later just for the sky, but to the total image I'm not gonna change any exposure. Alright, so always when I'm done with this part of the editing, I'm gonna look at the picture and play around with the white balance. Now this is a sunset, so I'm definitely gonna keep it warm here. I think that looks pretty well. So I'm gonna leave it there. Now to the tint. I absolutely love magenta in sunsets, so I'm gonna slide the slider to the right and add quite a bit of magenta, +50. So you can see here the before and the after. So already a huge difference, but we're not done yet. Now this whole editing process is quite heavy, so what you can get often is get a little bit too much contrast, or rather clarity. So what I'm often gonna do on these kind of images, once I've done so much adjustments to them, is minus the clarity by about 20. So it just gives a bit of the softness back to the image. So now we're back down here at the vibrance and saturation. I'm gonna play around with those sliders. I really like the vibrant slider much more than the saturation because it adds color much smoother than the saturation tool does. So I'm gonna add about +20 here. I really want it colorful in this image. And I'm still gonna play around with the saturation and just add a little bit, +3 in this case. So once I'm done with all of those adjustments, I'm usually gonna take care of the sky if it needs some adjustment. And here in this image it definitely needs some adjustment because it's just way too bright. So I'm gonna add a graduated filter. I'm gonna drag it over the sky, give it a little bit of a feather, and bring down the exposure slightly because the sky is so bright, until it looks better to the eye. Now you might say the sun is still overexposed right here, but if I would do that, everything else would just be totally underexposed in the sky, and the sun is still overexposed. So I think that looks pretty good. So now I'm gonna play around with the contrast. Again, this just affects the sky of the image, everything that's here and above. So just gonna play around with that, maybe a little bit, then play around with the clarity, maybe actually gonna give a little bit of a minus clarity, since I want those clouds to look a bit dreamy. So yeah, I think that looks pretty good. Now about the color, I really like the warmness of the color down on the grass, but I think the sky is almost a bit too warm. So I'm gonna add a little bit of blue until I find the white balance that I like for the sky. So this is great because you can see all the colors here. You can see the blue fading into the yellow, into the orange, into the reds. Absolutely beautiful dynamic of this image. So now I'm gonna leave the sky alone. I think it looks pretty good. So I'm gonna close the graduated filter, and now we're back here. So the next step of adjustments I'm gonna do is the tone curve. I always like to play around with the highlights. I usually add a little bit of plus highlights. Unlike the whites, it just adds a bit of exposure to the very highlights. You might say the sun is already overexposed, it's already blown out. Why do you want to add even more exposure? I just like the look of this blown out sun, to be honest. It gives the image a totally different feel. Then I'm gonna play around with the lights. Plus, minus. Now you can see the difference here. I'm definitely gonna go minus a bit with that. And the darks, don't think I'm gonna change much to the darks. Nope. Indeed, I'm actually gonna raise them for about 10. Shadows, just playing around with the settings. -6, somewhere around that, looks pretty well for the grass down here. So we're done with the tone curve and the adjustment up here. So let's go down to the color sliders. Now what I often like to do is go to the hue setting, choose this little point. By clicking it, I get a little point that I can drag anywhere on the image. And what it does is when I press on it and I pull my mouse down, it changes the hue of the color I've selected. So I'm just gonna play around with that. Maybe a little bit of plus. Gives a slight different look. Here before, here after. Really not that much, but I still like it. And I'm gonna do the same with the sky. Yeah, I think I'm gonna go minus a bit just to give a little bit more dynamic, a little bit more blue in the image, a little bit more variety. I'm gonna do the same with the orange tones. And I really like what it does when I go minus, because then the oranges change more to a red tone. And I really think it looks great for this image. Now down here at the saturation, I could play around with that, but I don't think I'm gonna change anything right here. Again, here you could change the saturation of the individual colors, but I really like how the saturation of this whole image looks, so I'm not gonna change anything there. So we're down here at the Luminance tool, and this actually increases or decreases the luminance of a particular color. You can either drag the sliders from left and right here on the slider bar, or you can again press this little thingy here, go to the color you want, press down the left mouse button and pull the mouse up and down. I really don't think I'm gonna add anything here. Gonna see how it does to the red and oranges. I actually think if I put it on the oranges and drag it down a little, it just helps with the contrast and the saturation. Just gonna play around with the blues right here, but I don't think I'm gonna change anything. Actually I do. I'm gonna add a little bit plus so it looks a bit lighter. So I'm done with the color sliders right here. The next step is split toning. Now split toning, what it does is either adding a color to the highlights of the image or to the shadows of the image with those two slider bars right here. So we're first here at the highlights. I'm gonna click this little box and you can see a palette of all the colors available. So you can see when I press here I have very strong reds, here very strong greens in the highlights, and you can just move around whatever color you like, and the further you go up the stronger the color becomes, and the lower you go down the lower the color in the highlights become. So I'm just gonna play around with the settings here. For sunset I often love to give a little bit of a blue light, but I don't think it works too well for this particular image. So I'm gonna try a little bit of red maybe. I'm gonna drag it a little bit down because that's definitely too much. I don't think I like this either. Now we're here at the very clear blues. You can see without any blues in the highlights and with some blues in the highlights. Now I like the effect the blues do to the highlights, but I just want a little bit. So you can see here 16%, 0%, 16, 0. So it just gives a little tiny bit more blue to the highlights, and I think that works pretty well for this particular image right here. Now shadows down here, I'm gonna play around with them as well. I often like to give some red into the shadows just to make it a little bit warmer. And you can see here I actually like this quite a bit. Again, very little, just 13%. You can see here how it looks without any colors in the shadows, and here with 13%. It's just a little tiny bit, but it does add to the image. So I'm gonna leave it there, close it, and go to the next module. Now we're here in the detail module, and first thing I'm gonna do is add some sharpness. I add some sharpness to all of my images. For that I'm just gonna go into the 1:1 perspective and bring the slider slightly up until I think there's enough sharpness in the image. Now I often add about 80 sharpness to most of my landscape images, but for this particular one, really I think 50 works pretty well. Now I'm gonna zoom out, press down the masking slider, press down the Alt key while still holding down the left mouse button, and bring it to the right. Now whatever is white is selected for sharpening, and whatever is black will not be sharpened. So I don't want the sky to be sharpened, so I'm just gonna drag it to the right until I don't see much of the cloud selected, and I'm gonna let go of both of them. Perfectly. Now noise reduction. In this image there is a bit of noise. I usually don't like the noise reduction tool too much because it takes a little bit away from the total sharpness, but I've increased the shadows so much that I'm gonna add some noise reduction. Just gonna see whatever it needs. I think 15 is enough for this image. Yeah, that looks pretty well. Now I often like to add some detail, because then the noise reduction doesn't look as plasticky. Alright, pretty well. Now the third slider is very important. It's the color slider, and what it does is it removes any of the purple and the green sensor noise that you get often in the raised shadows, just like you see here. The entire field is filled with them. Now I don't know how good this will come over on the video, but there's definitely something here. By default this slider is at 25. You can see here when I pull it down all the way, there's just so much color noise, especially here in the tree. You can see it very well. So I'm gonna turn up the slider until I cannot see any color noise in the darkest shadows, which is about 60 for this image. It really doesn't affect any of the other colors too much. Personally, I can't even see the difference on most of the images. Yeah, that's definitely way better. And there we go, we're done with the detail module as well. Alright, so next section is the lens correction section. What I always do on every single image is go to Profile, Enable Profile Corrections, choose my lens, in this instance the Canon 18-55 kit lens, and what it does is it removes all of the distortion from the lens as well as the vignetting. Then next I'm gonna go to Color and click on Remove Chromatic Aberration. And what this will do is get rid of some of the chromatic aberration you get on high contrast edges, such as these branches right here. You can see here quite a lot of green chromatic aberration. So I'm gonna press Remove Chromatic Aberration on, and you can see how all the chromatic aberration is gone. Without, with, without, with. So definitely looks way better with this turned on. Now if you have really high contrast, you can always play around with those settings to increase the amount of chromatic aberration removed even more. But on this particular image, it works pretty well just by the default option. So I'm gonna zoom back out here again and go to the next section called Effects. Now this is a very powerful tool called Vignetting. What Vignetting will do is it adds darkness to the edges of the image, which helps a lot with mood and dragging the eye of the viewer of the image more towards the center. You can see here, I'm just gonna play around with the amount, not too much. Yeah, I think that works pretty well. -21. Of course, different with every single image, and depending on your taste. You can see here without any vignetting, and with, without, and with. I add vignetting to almost all of my images because it has such a nice effect. You could play around with the midpoints here as well, but honestly, I don't need that right here. So we're here at the last tab of the Lightroom editing sections, called Camera Calibration. So what you can do here is play around with the profiles. I often like to go to Camera Landscape and see how this looks. It's definitely a totally different feel to the image. I'm trying to decide what I like better. I think I'm gonna stay with Adobe Standard because that's just a little bit too much pop for my taste. You can play around with the other settings as well. Portrait, not really. Camera Standard, definitely not. So I'm gonna stick here with the Adobe Standard. And down here you have the primary colors that you can change the hue on and the saturation. It's a little bit more of a rough adjustment than up here at the HSL tool, the color sliders, but I'm still gonna play around with them. I usually always do. You never know if there's just something you like better. For example, here in the shadow tint, I think a little bit of green actually works quite well. So again here, before and after, just gives a little bit of the green back to the grass that we've lost through the editing process. Then red primary, play around with the sliders here. I usually always go to the extremes to see if there's a massive difference. Now red primary, I'm actually gonna put at -10 here. It just helps with the oranges, makes it more of a red, and I really like that. Next saturation. Don't think I'm gonna like any of that. Nope, that's all too much or too less, so I'm gonna leave it at 0. Green primary, doing the same thing as I did on the red. But here I really don't like any of those. So I'm gonna reset the green primary hue, play around with the saturation. Don't like any of that. And we are here at the last primary color, the blue. Those tend to have quite a lot of impact to the image. So I'm gonna play around with that. Maybe just give it a little bit of a plus, just tiny bit. Here again, before, after, there's really a very slight difference. Alright, so we're done with all of the global adjustments, and we've added already a gradient filter to the sky. And what I'm gonna do here is actually add another gradient filter and just put it at the bottom of the image right here, like that, and put the exposure on minus exposure, just because that helps to close the image and gives a little bit more attention to the center, to the sun, to the tree. Same thing I'm gonna do on the top of the image, not quite as strong here. Again, it just closes the top of the image and makes the eye wander towards the center. Now what I'm gonna do is add an adjustment brush, go on plus exposure and actually a bit of plus shadow, and make it quite big, add a lot of feather, and go over the tree here. You can see those beautiful leaves and flowers on this tree. Got kinda lost because of our heavy editing and adding lots of contrast. Actually, I think I'm gonna add even more exposure here. Maybe even gonna increase the shadows all the way. Yeah, bring back the exposure just a tiny bit. And you can see here, without, very dark tree, and with, it just brings back the details of the flowers on the tree. And you can see here, this section of the tree is a bit darker than this one, so I'm gonna add a new brush, same settings, and just gonna brush over this section of the tree. And there's still a bit of dark spot left here, so I'm gonna add again a new brush, same settings, and brush over here. So that's absolutely beautiful. Gonna add some of exposure here. That definitely looks great. So you can see here without the adjustment brush and with the adjustment brush. Totally different look to the tree. So I like this. And what I'm gonna do now is add some gradient filters. And just take this whole section here, reset the exposures and put down the exposure a bit just to give the image a bit more dynamic. Gonna make it even bigger. You have to be sure to invert mask here and put the feather to 100, otherwise it will look terrible like this. You want it just very smooth, you want it to look very natural. And I'm gonna add maybe one more here to make everything a bit darker, add some mood to the image. Then I'm gonna right click and duplicate this one, just gonna drag it down here, maybe a little bit less exposure here, and you can see without, with. Really small difference, but it's definitely something you'll notice. So now I'm gonna add some new gradient filters and put just some plus exposure and some plus contrast to some parts of the image, just to give the picture a little bit more of interest, to make the light a little bit more complex. I really love doing that. Changes the image quite a bit. Play around with that here. Bit more exposure here, more clarity. Maybe one here. and another one here, more clarity. Alright, so you can see now without any gradient filters, and you can see here how we've complexified the light. Actually, I think those are a bit too obvious, too much, so I'm gonna bring back the exposure on those two right here. Yeah, that definitely looks way better. So I'm gonna close the gradient filter and we're pretty much done. Yeah, I think this looks great. So let's see the before and after. Let me scroll down on this huge history tab. So you can see here import. Very dark, blown out highlights, almost black shadows, you can see anything. The flowers on the tree are underexposed. And here's the after, absolutely huge difference, really huge. And when I'm looking at it, I'm actually gonna add another gradient filter here and go minus exposure just a bit. You often find some little things to change on the image after looking away for some time or looking at something else just for a few seconds. Just gives you a new idea, new look on the image. I think that looks really awesome though, and I'm done. Now it's very hard to, of course, make a Lightroom guide on how to edit landscapes, because there are so many different ways to edit every landscape, there are so many different types of landscapes. It's impossible to put all of those varieties and possibilities in one video. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna make some more videos and show you how I retouch those landscapes, so you can see the different looks and different ways I retouch them. But that's just an overall tutorial. Let me know what you think in the comment section down below. Also leave a comment if you have a question or a critique. Like the video if it helped you out, if it gave you new ideas, new inspiration to edit your landscape. And dislike the video if it did not help you out at all. Subscribe for more landscape editing videos, as well as other photography related videos, and have an amazing day.